China don't want to go to war with each other, and this is the strategy they're using to make sure a catastrophic conflict doesn't happen. The United States and China have national security goals that are at odds with each other, and they see each other's actions as threatening to global peace, especially in the South China Sea and around the island of Taiwan. Military strategists from both countries focus on deterring or discouraging each other from any action that might trigger war. How did we get here, and where are we going? We talked to two experts to understand how the US and China are trying to deter conflict while still working towards their national security goals.
The United States and China, we have some disagreements over what deterrence is. I think the general view is that U.S. forward presence has been what has convinced countries not to use force to accomplish their goals since the end of World War II. The reason we have peace and stability in Asia is because the U.S. military is there to very proactively encourage everyone to behave themselves, right? So the U.S. position is, if the United States pulled back, this is when countries feel like they have the right or license to use aggression to achieve their goals. So China does not like to be deterred, because being deterred means the United States is actively limiting China's choices and saying, no, if you attack Taiwan, that's not going to end well for you. If you harass the Philippines, it's not going to end well for you. And China, as a great power, feels like that's unfair. It should be able to do whatever it wants to do. The U.S. position is, since World War II, that is not how the international order works anymore. You can't just take what you want because you're strong. And so it's very important for the United States to be able to deter that. Now, in order to deter that, really, many people are focused on U.S. resolve. Whether or not the United States is or isn't willing to do certain things is somewhat unknowable. The Chinese know that, and so they basically have to assume the U.S. is going to try. So the big question is whether or not the U.S. has the capabilities. And the United States has been focused on fighting a different type of war, basically doing worst-case scenario planning of if we had to fight a multi-year war against China. But just because, and we've seen this, I think, with the war on terror, just because the U.S. military is capable of doing very high-end things doesn't mean it's capable of doing low-end things. And so now the question comes, what about if that war lasts 3 weeks? China's fighting from the Chinese mainland, which is very close to everything. The majority of forces assigned to the Indo-Pacific, they're not in Japan or South Korea. They're in places like California. So the United States faces this, time distance problem, we call it, of geography. And that's why it's also very important that the U.S. has allies and partners. China might not need them, because China doesn't need to operate from other countries, but the United States explicitly needs to operate from other countries in order to have the effectiveness of military power to stop a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, for example, or to be more present in the South China Sea to ensure freedom of navigation. You need a certain amount of military power and capability to deter aggression, but how much is too much that it provokes aggression?
Their concept of deterrence is actually somewhat similar to ours in terms of its comprehensiveness. Nuclear is part of it, and they are rapidly expanding and modernizing their nuclear forces to be able to put a nuclear shadow over any conflict that we would choose or dare to become involved in, but also in many other ways. So there is a concept of space deterrence. The idea is if you get involved, we could wreak havoc on your access to outer space. There's cyber deterrence, so we could use cyber tools to challenge your critical infrastructure in the United States, and they're actively pursuing those options right now. And they're showing off some of it too, because I think what they want to do is to communicate to our leadership that if you were to cross over China's red lines, then they have options to really wreak havoc on certain systems in the United States. So think telecoms, think power grids, think communications. I mean, just kind of just go down the list, but it's a deterrent tool. And that's been, I think well understood by our side as well. And then you have other things in addition to that, including just simply messaging. And I think part of what China tries to accomplish in its deterrent signaling is to make the case that they inherently care more about these issues than we do, that they're public. The metaphorical 1.4 billion Chinese are fired up by U.S. provocations and will never agree to back down, and that they could fully mobilize their society to fight a long and protracted war, and they'll fight to the bitter end, and we won't. And so that's also mixed up with their deterrent strategy.
The problem is not all interest areas, but there's some things that China just cannot achieve without use of force. When you talk about whether or not China is overreaching, it's like, well, what are what are the alternatives? At least in my view, in the current situation, I don't see the people of Taiwan requesting to be under Communist Party rule unless there's some sort of kinetic use of force. South China Sea is a bit different because you do have those gray zone tactics. Most of the territories that are under dispute are uninhabited, so you can kind of exercise de facto control without a war. It's situation to situation, but the bottom line is it has to be a balance between how much China wants something, because the only way to get it is through use of force, and what they think the costs are going to be associated with trying. And we're lucky in that, Chinese leaders have really cared about the future of China. Xi Jinping is no exception. And so if it looks like it's going to be a huge economic cost or political cost or whatever, that's what, has imposed caution on them, and the ability, of course, of the United States military to potentially stop that conflict. And then also the repercussions afterwards, because there's no situation under which the Chinese military kills thousands of Americans and then we're just like friends afterwards, right? So it also opens up the possibility of a whole other sort of bipolar world that nobody wants. But U.S. policy also has to be very careful not to do stupid things to push them into a war of necessity mentality in which it looks like their survival is based on having to take this territory by force. Because then it doesn't mean that they'll be irrational, but it means that they'll be willing to accept higher costs, and that maybe we wouldn't have a deterrent in place that would be enough to prevent them from using force in some of those scenarios.
The idea here is that you're not seeking conflict with China, you're seeking to avoid it. And deterrence, it's a much broader concept, and in recent years it's become known as sort of integrated deterrence. And what you're trying to do here is to use the possibility of a large military punishment on one hand, but then also bringing in economic punishments, diplomatic punishments. And so integrating those different tools of deterrence, but then also bringing in the idea of reassurance, which is sometimes lost in these discussions, and to say, we are not actually encouraging Taiwan independence, for example. And as long as you refrain from using lethal force to settle this dispute, we are not prepared to cross your red line. So there is an assurance dimension to our larger deterrence strategy as well. But then from China's point of view, deterrence serves a somewhat different purpose. So I don't think it's so much that they are seeking to deter American unprovoked military aggression. I mean, we do not have territorial claims in the Pacific that we're seeking to realize. I think what they're trying to deter would be, number one, larger level political support by the United States for Taiwan. They don't want to see it. They think that things like arms sales or even just explicit political support for the leadership in Taiwan is a provocation. And so I think they're trying to think through how do they deter that. But number two would be the possibility that the United States would choose to intervene on behalf of Taiwan in a conflict. And so if they believe they needed to go to war, what they want to deter is active support during the war by the United States.
It's not that I don't understand the Chinese position, but it's not good for the United States and U.S. allies and partners. I mean, we have created a system that is the most favorable to us. And us, I mean the United States. There's no situation under which if we outsource our interests in security to China, like they would make better choices for the United States than we would for ourselves. So the U.S. desire to maintain its dominant position is completely understandable. On the other hand, China's frustration with what seems like an arbitrary rules, I completely understand it's frustrating. But you have people in power that are, the gatekeepers, and those people, it makes it harder for people who are different to make their way to the top. Anyone who's experienced this within our own society understands that you encounter a lot of rules and norms that seem completely arbitrary and created to keep you out. And so that's how the Chinese view a lot of it, like, well, it's not so much performance-based. It's like, are you a democracy or not? Like, you're not, okay, you're out type of thing. And so that I can see is very frustrating for them, but that's the whole purpose of being a hegemon, is ensuring that the rules of engagement are favorable to your own interests, reduces your transaction costs from interacting with other countries, and that other countries concede to your preferences before anyone else's. Those are the rules of the game. So it's not crazy that the Chinese would want the same thing. It's not good for the United States and its allies if China gets its way. And so we do have this, I think naturally conflictual situation.
So what you have are two great powers who are simultaneously trying to deter the other through similar kinds of signaling. What that does, though, I think, for stability is it creates certain risk, because you have both sides showing off, revealing, and pressing some of the boundaries. on the other's appetite. So, for example, in space, we see China conducting anti-satellite tests. In cyber, we see certain cases where they're revealing a bit of their capability. We see just in the conventional domain, both sides kind of pushing the envelope on what the other is willing to tolerate. And in the midst of that, you have risk of a miscalculation, the risk of an accident, and the risk of unintended escalation. And so just as both sides are trying to simultaneously deter the other from not crossing over these thresholds, on the other hand, you also have kind of a growing recognition, I think, both in Washington, in Beijing, that overdoing it on deterrence actually could create profound risks for both sides in the conventional and in the strategic domains. And that creates a certain aperture for conversation between the two capitals on how far are we really going to go and what rules of behavior do we need to institutionalize so that we can avoid outcomes that we don't seek, which would be sort of an unintended crisis. And so all of these things are happening simultaneously right now, and it's a little bit hard to see in the future where this will go. But I think there is a general recognition on both sides that there is a need to temper all of this deterrence signaling activity with prudent conversations and the building up of norms and rules of behavior so that this competition doesn't steer right off the highway, so that we don't create the very thing that we're trying to avoid.
Now that we have a sense of the similarities and differences between the US and China when it comes to deterrence, what do we do about it?
I kind of really find compelling some of the writings of Yan Xuetong on this when he kind of says, like, it's just better for us to be honest about where we are, right? Like, we cannot pretend that what the United States wants is best for China. What China wants is best for the United States. We want different things. The perfect world in our minds is different. Whether we like it or not, the United States and China are responsible for the future of the world. This is a responsibility that is on our shoulders that no one else in the world can understand what that's like, that the decisions and policies of your country determine the destiny of mankind. Despite any frustrations we have with each other, at the end of the day, our number one responsibility is to make sure this whole thing doesn't blow up. The only thing we really have in common is just how amazingly destructive fighting a war against one another would be. And I think people do not have any understanding that this would be the worst war this world has ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of people dying very quickly. And this is just on the conventional side. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the aftermath of a world in which we don't have this level of engagement. I mean, even now, you could say we're at a fault line.
And so if we can find ways to really clarify what our interests are and what our objectives are in the region, to be very candid about that, but then also to have productive discussions, as I said earlier, on what happens if there is a misperception and a inadvertent sort of escalation of forces between the U.S. and China. How do we handle that? How do we think about that? It would be unprecedented. On one hand, I think we need to try to do what we can to strengthen deterrence so that Xi Jinping does not get into the mindset of Putin. But on the other hand, really have those honest and candid conversations about what we need to do to maintain broader strategic stability in the region so that neither side believes that force is really to their benefit and is